Okay, hi, and welcome back to the absolutely zero people that are currently watching this. Hi, guys. Am I going to spin plates for a little bit? No, mostly not. Okay, so this is going to be Jekyll and Hyde. I've decided I'm just going to read the novel. No, this is going to be Jekyll and Hyde. So again, the sort of virtual lesson quotation bank is available to you. There's a lot more on it for Jekyll and Hyde, just because I think this is a bit more of a case that you need to select the quotations yourself slightly more. Wow, this is streaming at a really low rate now, isn't it? This is appalling. I need to ring my internet service provider and have a go at them. That'll be fun. Okay, so there's a lot more here for this, but it is also something that you have to sort of select your quotations for yourself a little bit more. So, Dr. Jekyll, or more specifically, the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is Robert Louis Stevenson's late Victorian Gothic novella. So, would we call this fin de siècle? Yeah, we might do actually. So this is a sort of fin de siècle novel. Fin de siècle meaning end of an era. So, and that's quite useful to understand this as a text. So, Stevenson is writing right at the end of the Victorian period. It's published in 1886, and he falls into a general movement of late Victorian science fiction writers, and we would call this a science fiction text. Victorian era is the birthplace of science fiction as we know it. It's not where science fiction begins. That actually begins quite a long time before with things like, well, to be honest, a lot of people now read The Tempest as a science fiction text, but those people are mental. But science fiction starts sort of 70 years before this, but this is where it's picking up. And it's picking up because people are actually making discoveries now. So whereas at the beginning of the science fiction era, the sort of discoveries people are making are very fundamental. They're things like the possibility of forces actually existing. Now people are discovering things in the realm of medicine, in the realm of technology, that are actually causing them to question the way in which they've lived their lives up until this point. Stevenson was very interested in this. He was very interested in the possibility of a split or multiple personality. We know this. He met someone in an asylum who had multiple personalities, multiple personality dissociative disorder, I believe it's called. And he had been working on a text about this for a significant period of time. He was absolutely fascinated by this. And he sort of, he didn't really want to write it in a way about this guy Louis Vivet, who was the patient. He wasn't greatly sure whether it was a good idea. It became an allegory, so a sort of story with a message behind it. But he actually sort of he hated it himself. He hated the story he was writing, and we have this probably apocryphal story, to be perfectly honest, that he burnt his original manuscript. So he wrote the manuscript. It took him a long time to write it, with a lot of feedback from his partner, and then he burnt it, and then he changed his mind, possibly under the influence of incredibly powerful hallucinogenics, and then rewrote it over the course of a couple of days. We know that he was potentially an opium user. There was a lot of opium use at this time in Victorian London, which we see referenced in the text quite a lot, actually, if you know where to look for it. And he rewrote his manuscript. Now, it's a Gothic text. It's a late Gothic text because the Gothic era is sort of waxing at this point in time. Sorry, waning at this point in time. It's on the fall. And he's a really strange person to have written it. It doesn't fit in with the rest of his sort of canon of literature. He was, to all intents and purposes, a children's writer. He wrote Treasure Island. He wrote Shipwrecked. He wrote texts like this that were adventure stories for young boys, in a way in which was only just happening in Victorian London, or Victorian literature. Now, he was a Scotsman. He was an Edinburgh native, and but he wrote this novella. Remember, it's a novella because it's super short. This novella about London. So he wrote this possibly under the influence of opium, possibly under the influence of cocaine, and it has this very ethereal nature to it. This dreamscape of London, which is all at once London and not London. Also has huge elements of Edinburgh about it as well. So a lot of critics suggest that actually this isn't a novella about. Sorry, just been talking about a play for an hour, so can't talk about novellas apparently. That this novella actually isn't about London at all. What it's about is Edinburgh. It's just that he didn't think that a novella about Edinburgh would sell. The big literary market at the time was London. Big literary market is still London, but the big literary market was London, and so he instead of sort of setting it in the city that he wanted to, he set it in London instead. But it's not quite London. It's always been this very ethereal, very sort of tricky book to pin down where it's meant to be about. So Stevenson was a children's novel writer, and he was quite successful at this. His books are still incredibly widely read. I'd say that Muppet Treasure Island has done a lot to making sure that Treasure Island is still a popular text. And so he writes this Gothic novel. The Gothicism is one of these things that everyone thinks they know what it is, but actually it's far more specific than that. It's a bit like modernism in the same way. So what is Gothicism? Gothicism is profoundly a reaction to the development of the world, and the development of the metropolis, of the city. So what it is that it's all about tensions and dichotomies. So it is about the ongoing battle between good and evil at its core, and it's the ongoing battle between good and evil within humanity, that both things exist and are always in tension, and about sort of light and darkness, so civilization and barbarism, about sort of the idea of what it means to be human versus the knowledge that being human is also being an animal, and what that means at the same time. So that is what Gothicism is about. Those are the sort of core meta-narratives, is this struggle between two things trying to occupy the same space, and always being in tension with each other. Now that makes it fairly obviously a Gothic novel. There are other things that come packaged with that though. The supernatural is a huge trope of Gothicism. It's one of those things that turns up in every Gothic text, is an idea of something supernatural. If we move forward into the 1980s, so 100 years after it's written, we get a Gothic revival. It starts with a book called The Wasp Factory by Ian Banks, is one of the really important ones. And that loses that element of the supernatural and is instead just heavily involved with this good versus evil within a person. But while we're in the late Gothic era, the late Victorian era, apologies. We're still very much influenced by the supernatural, and it's presented as a realistic supernatural. So it's a supernatural that exists within the text, and it's never questioned or presented as being unbelievable. It's just something that's there. It lives, it happens, it's a thing that is there. So the supernatural in this is the sort of science supernatural, but we can see there's a heavy blending of sort of Christological ideas or ideals against sort of scientific ideals. So within this text, the core dichotomy is that of science versus religion, even though religion isn't necessarily presented as being religion per se. It's presented as being religious ideals. It's presented as being the idea of what sin is, of what good is. Whereas I think Stevenson, through the course of it, is also questioning whether those things actually exist in any way at all. Is there actually a sin? Is there actually a good? Now, we know that the heavily influencing text is that of Darwin and Darwin's Origin of the Species, and his concept, because it is a concept at this point in time, his concept of evolution and natural selection and how that shapes what we are as a human being. Now, interestingly, and I say this quite often, Darwin was not against the church. Darwin was not a man that was in some sort of fight against religion. He didn't think that there was an absolute choice between science and religion. Actually, when he wrote Origin of the Species, what he fundamentally believed was that he was proving the subtlety and power of God. He thought that he was a bit of evidence for God. He thought that he was proving that God's creation was so great that God could manipulate it and change it over time, and the subtleties were so beautiful that this was proof of God's power. Which I don't know if we could suddenly bring Darwin back today, he would sort of want to go back and undo his work. But the important thing to understand is that the intention of Darwin was not to destroy the church. It was not to sort of change how people thought about whether religion was a real thing, or based on reality. It was about the fact that he was trying to prove God's power, actually. And then the last bit of framing context is more of a sort of socio-political one, and that is that it is what being a Victorian person was like. What being a Victorian person was like was that the Victorian era was one where externally it was very dour, it was very controlled, and it was not a particularly well-received thing to show your emotions all the time. But internally it was or the private, so it's about public versus private really. In terms of the private, the Victorian society was absolutely fascinated by horror, by the terrifying, by sort of margins of sexuality, and what we see is actually a really troubled split generation or set of generations where people were externally tried to live up to this very strong public persona of like rugged Christianity is what it's called, but then internally it was, and in the private they went against that completely. And this is the era of the sort of secret club. If you want to do a little bit of research in this, you can go and look up the Hellfire Club. which is these sort of fascinating thing which started in the started sort of in the mid 1700s, but really sort of grew up later on, and there's loads of these clubs, these sort of exclusive gentlemen's clubs, mostly gentlemen's clubs, that were absolutely devoted to sort of a very private, very debauched life in defiance of the external public solidarity. So what we get is what is The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde then as a novella in terms of narrative. What does Stevenson gives us? Stevenson gives us a nice little mystery story in a way, that's fairly similar in writing style to a lot of his other texts, but it does have this ethereal quality to it that is missing from things like Shipwrecked. What he gives us is a complex narrative that's built on different structures. So he has elements of letters. There are about 4 different people that actually tell the story in different places, and we get a novel that is eponymous in that it's named after the main characters, but it's actually not eponymous because the main characters aren't Jekyll and Hyde. The main character is Utterson. And actually, Utterson is really easy to forget. He's a massively easy to forget a character as a character. So let's begin with Utterson. So Mr. Utterson, the lawyer, was a man of rugged countenance that was never lighted by a smile. Now, what we're given from the very opening is a character that completely adheres to the idea of what a Victorian gentleman's meant to look like. He's not meant to smile. He's meant to be very controlled. He is an absolutely ideal character for a Victorian era. He is hugely reflective of Victorianism. He goes about his job, he does well, and that's it. He is a lawyer, and he's described as being frequently the last good influence in the lives of downgoing men. He is a almost philanthropic character. So he's the sort of guy that we still have the death penalty, and that downgoing has a very sinister turn to it, doesn't it? We assume that is a pun either on people being hanged or people that are descending in society. He is the last person. He is the lawyer that sticks up for the people that are about to lose their lives to the law, effectively. So Utterson has this place in society that is very controlled. He has this place in society that is very reputable, and he sticks up for people at the end of their time. But notice the continuous verb, downgoing. He's it sort of implies that he's not actually terribly successful at saving them. And there is an idea within Victorian society that once someone begins a fall, they just continue it. Now, as you probably know, I'm really interested in the presentation of the city in this novella, as my absolute fascination is the way in which Stevenson. I wasn't terribly pro this text actually when I first put it on the syllabus. I put it on the syllabus under the basis that I'd read about it in another book, and had seen it from its slightly different angle in a book called Psychogeography by a guy called Merlin Coverley, a critic. And his sort of consistent, which is actually an interesting little bit of text to read if you want a different perspective on this, come and ask me for it, and I'll photocopy the relevant pages for you if you want them. What is interesting about it is the fact that it's presented as being a is presented that London is actually works as a character within this text, but it also works in terms of euphemisms. Stevenson constantly uses like really simple phrases to make a comment on how people perceive the how people actually perceive the world around them. So the street was small and what is called quiet, but it drove a thriving trade on the weekdays. And it's that phrase, what is called quiet, that euphemism. And it's a euphemism because it alludes to something else. And it's that thing, what is called quiet. It implies that the street isn't actually quiet. It's just that people call it quiet. And what that's about is that's a sort of idiomatic metaphor for a lack of crime, or being in a positive or affluent area. Because it says it drove a thriving trade on the weekdays. It's not quiet. It's just nothing of any, nothing out of the ordinary goes on there. Which is also a sort of foreshadowing that something will. Someone's asked me whether a man of rugged countenance that was never lighted by a smile is a metaphor. Yeah, you're quite right, because of course it's that bit, never lighted by a smile. A smile doesn't literally light something up. That's an idiom and a phrase. So yeah, it is a metaphor. It's not a very secure one though, because lighted can have a couple of different meanings, most of which are a metaphor in this case. So you're probably all right saying it. In fact, I think you are all right saying it. In fact, say it. It's fine. So what is called quiet gives us a really strong indication of what values are held to be true in Victorian society at this time. It's a lack of danger, it's a lack of intrigue or anything beyond the normality of society. And we've got another metaphor here in this next one. Well, it was this way, returned Mr. Enfield. I was coming home from some place at the end of the world. Now, we can presume he doesn't mean the end of the world. Now, the end of the world, this is like very much post Flat Earth, but pre-Flat Earth revivalist. It's post Flat Earth, so people know that the world's a globe, so it has no end to it. The end of the world here is a metaphor for a bad place in London. But what that gives us is this metaphor implies the microcosm of London. That London is the world to the people that live within it. So Mr. Enfield views London as just being the world. That there's no reason to venture off outside of it because everything is there. And it also tells us, in terms of writer's craft, that Stevenson is going to write about London and write about these characters as if they are within their own world, aside from everything else. Now, whether you read that as being a sort of dreamscape, a sort of external to reality is up to you. But it also implies this idea of sin and vice and poverty. That the end of the world is where people go to die or people go to disappear. And so when Enfield comes back from it, he's coming back into the light. The next one is one of their phrases that I think most of you probably know. Or at least you know two words of it and can put the bit of technical terminology to it. The horrible part of the thing, for the man trampled calmly over the child's body and left her screaming on the ground. Is our trampled calmly. This is Hyde before we know it's Hyde. Now, trampled calmly as an oxymoron to describe Hyde is really useful because it implies that he views his actions as being absolutely fine, and it makes us to think there's something guiltless or abnormal about Hyde, that he can't view his actions as the realities they are. And then on the next one here, we also get another Hyde oxymoron, sneering coolness. And then we get a lovely litote as well. We also get the really clumsy... So one of the things about Stevenson's writing for children is that he sometimes ends up making really clumsy similes and clumsy phrases. So we'll have, if you shall be Mr. Hyde, I shall be Mr. Seek a little bit later, which is just the clumsiest pun. But here we get a really clumsy simile. I could see that, but carrying it off, sir, really like Satan. Now, for a book that is really subtle in places, that is the clumsiest of similes. And we're not here to judge Stevenson's writing ability. He's a fantastic writer. Was a fantastic writer. So he's very much dead. He was a fantastic writer. But really like Satan is really jamming it down our throats that this Hyde is not a very nice character. And this is in chapter 1, remember. So we're being set this up. We're being absolutely set up as a reader that this guy is not nice, he is not pleasant, and that he has some connection to ideas of sin or violence or evil with him. What I'm more interested in is the litote. No gentleman but wishes to avoid a scene. This is an embedded quotation about from Hyde. No gentleman but wishes to avoid a scene. Now it's a litote because it describes because it explains things through the negative. No gentleman but wishes. So it's a double litote or a double negative. What it actually means is gentlemen wish to avoid a scene. We can just cancel those two out. But the fact that it's told in this double lito implies that the fact it's told in this litotical phrase, that is a word instantly, litotical, implies that Hyde always views things from the other side. I know this is a bit of an interpretive stretch, but I think this is a really valid point. That Hyde talks in litotes because he sees things from the negative. And so Stevenson places us in Hyde's frame of mind by the litotical phrase that Hyde uses to explain. That's a really nice language point that's quite high up on the sort of ability spectrum. So no gentleman but wishes to avoid a scene. A litotical phrase implying that Hyde always views things from a negative side. I think if you can make that statement in an exam, you're gonna do well, as long as it's relevant to the question, of course. But if you get a Hyde question, especially if you got that bit as the extract, that would be wonderful. I think we got a Hyde question last year, so I wouldn't bank on getting one. But this exam board seems to be setting the precedent that they can do what the hell they want. So I wouldn't discount them doing sort of the same thing twice, effectively. Just give me a second. Sorry, just spilling coffee on my laptop there, as usual. Interesting. Okay. Okay. The next one is a sort of... This is quite a nice phrase for explaining how Victorian society views things. Victorian society is the first time that people are actually bothering to be interested in mental health. Now, they're not quite doing it right, in that it was still quite common in this time for people to pay to visit mental asylums as a sort of afternoon excursion. So, you know, like saying that, oh, it's raining, don't really want to go anywhere shopping, why don't we go to a museum or the mental asylum to have a wander around and laugh at some people. But that was becoming less and less as more and more people got involved in the philanthropy of developing this. But people were actively interested in the idea of madness and mental health particularly. Now, what's interesting here is this phrase that we're just going to look at sets up a dichotomy between being mad that was acceptable and social disgrace that was unacceptable. I thought it was madness, he said, as he replaced the obnoxious paper in the safe. And now I begin to fear it is disgrace. So, if it's madness, it's fine, because it's madness. Whereas on the other side, actively doing things that would bring you into disgrace is something to be feared. And so, what this shows us is that Victorian society says you can do stupid things, or you can do things that don't seem acceptable, as long as there's a sort of medical cause for them. On the other hand, if you just do them because you're falling out of society's favour, then this is wrong. It's quite a subtle point there, but it's quite interesting. And in a text that is profoundly about madness versus sanity, it is an interesting thing to look at. To go, okay, well, why is that being set up as a dichotomy between madness and disgrace? Why is that a thing? So, it is more than 10 years since Henry Jekyll became too fanciful for me. He began to go wrong in mind, and though of course I continue to take an interest in him for old sake's sake, as they say, I see and have seen devilish little of the man. Such unscientific balderdash, added the doctor, flushing suddenly purple. Now, what we see here is the divide in science between those that were pursuing something that they thought to be correct and those that were pursuing something that was believed to be spiritual or unethical. And he began to go wrong in mind. And what we're being shown is that Stevenson is presenting us the downfall of someone through their choices. And there's a really strong juxtaposition here between the word fanciful, meaning to have ideas unbased in reality, but in quite a sort of flippant, casual way. And then that phrase, such unscientific balderdash. Now, balderdash means stupidity. But what we're being given is someone who's doing something that's really quite serious and is going to heavily affect other people's lives, but also being described in a flippant, in a way that sort of comes away from that and presents it as being trifling, not that serious. But science was a big thing. The amateur scientist was a huge thing. People were pursuing science of their own volition, in their own sort of, developing their own sort of studios, and it was a pursuit of people in the upper classes to go and do scientific experiments. Just for fun, as a pastime. When you come back from visiting the mental asylum, you go and do some experiments just as a gentleman scientist. And there is a fear of this within society. So although people are doing it and they're getting a lot of good things out of it, particularly in sort of medicine, it's also the amateur sort of playing with science. Science was to the upper classes what sort of golf is now. I guess it's a fairly vague parody. Our next one is another city quotation. He would be aware of the great field of lamps of a nocturnal city, then of the figure of a man walking swiftly, then of a child running from the doctors. And then these met, and that human juggernaut trod the child down and passed on regardless of her screams. I love that phrase, the great field of lamps of a nocturnal city. Nocturnal meaning to exist at night. And there's something that does. So a nocturnal city, that's an epithet, nocturnal city. And it presents the idea that there is more than one city in one space. So although we have this physical geographic space of the city, it's a different city at night than it is in the day. And that dichotomy is also reflected in its people. And then we get our human juggernaut, which is our incredibly famous little phrase. Human juggernaut being a metaphor. Juggernaut being a sort of unstoppable machine is one of its interpretations, but it's also got this religious connotation of a sort of how do I say it? A statue, possibly, or like movable movable shrine on wheels that fanatics used to throw their bodies under in order to sacrifice themselves. But the sort of general connotation is this idea of sort of unstoppableness. But also human juggernaut, is there an oxymoronic phrase there? Yeah, you can have that as an oxymoron, but it's also it's simply a metaphor as well. But I like the idea that these things can only happen at night, and we talk about the diurnal nature of this text. That sometimes it happens during night, sometimes it happens during the day, and it lapses in and out. That different things happen at night to those things that happen during the day. Now, Hyde is not present. I see so many things about. I think this is one of these things where once you read this text, you realise how wrong every presentation of Jekyll and Hyde is in the media, in films, particularly, where people that decide that the easy way to do this is just to present Hyde as this like hulking, violent monster. But the description of him is so much more subtle than that. Mr. Hyde was pale and dwarfish. He gave an impression of deformity without any nameable malformation. He had a displeasing smile, and he bore himself to the lawyer with a sort of murderous mixture of timidity and boldness. And he spoke with a husky, whispering and somewhat broken voice. All these were points against him. But not all of these together could explain the hitherto unknown disgust, loathing, and fear with which Mr. Utterson regarded him. There must be something else, said the perplexed gentleman. There is something more, if I could find a name for it. God bless me, the man seems hardly human. Something troglodytic. Okay, a troglodyte is a sort of prehistoric animal. So we'll work backwards through this text. Now, I don't expect you to be able to memorize that entire paragraph. That would be insane. But this is for you to sort of pick out some of the ways in which he's described and learn those and have those in your sort of arsenal for when you go into the exam. So a troglodyte is a prehistoric animal. So the insinuation there is that he is inhuman, but not just that he is inhuman in a sort of horizontal manner, but he is inhuman in a way that he is pre-human. So he is a troglodyte is not on the same sort of evolutionary pathway as mankind. I don't know whether that would be, people would be aware of that, but there's a reading from there. And this idea that he seems hardly human. It's not that he doesn't seem human, he only just seems human. As if he's adopting the form of humanity in order to disrupt it. And Stevenson is presenting us that rupture, that jilt, that slight offness. He's not totally opposed. He's humanity down a different pathway. And perhaps that is a criticism or a mention of Stevenson about what Darwin is doing, in that Hyde is presenting a different evolutionary pathway, a different version of humanity. What happened if? It's like a grand what if story. There are a couple of standard Hyde oxymorons here for those people building up a catalogue of Hyde oxymorons. A mixture of timidity and boldness. It's not a true oxymoron, but they are opposites. To be timid is to be quiet and reluctant, whereas to be bold is to be loud and forthright. So we have, it's not an oxymoron, but it's an opposition. It's again that sense that he is always two opposites in one. But then we also have this, he gave an impression of deformity without any nameable malformation. So there is an impression of deformity. It's not a physical thing, it's a feeling. He had a displeasing smile, which is displeasing smile, and would we have that as an oxymoron? Possibly not, but there's definitely contrast in there. And then that standard sort of pale and dwarfish. I quite like the phrase somewhat broken voice as a usable comment, because referring to him as broken implies that he is broken from humanity. And then our next one, the important bit is, if I ever read Satan's signature upon a face, it is on that of your new friend. Okay, this idea of Satan's signature is really useful, that Satan has sort of signed off on this. So if we think of where signatures are used, they're used at the bottom of contracts, but they're also used on art forms or artworks. So it is as if Satan has signed off, he is attributing that this is his bit of work. And that's how that phrase works, really. It's not just a case of that he is attributed to, that he's sort of connected to Satan. He's actually attributed to him, that Satan is taking ownership of that as his work. It's easy to say this is a link to Satan, but we need to be a little subtler than that. So he's attributed to Satan, that Satan has actually taken ownership. I think I might have said Shakespeare in there at some point. Apologise. The large handsome face of Dr. Jekyll grew pale to the very lips, and there came a blackness about his eyes. I picked this out of not a very long chapter. As I said, I'm sort of picked out various bits that I think are, have got learnable elements to them. You're welcome to go off key, but I'm trying to sort of do each of these in just over an hour, so it's a bit of a whip through of everything. I think just this idea of sort of paleness and blackness appearing, like someone's turning the contrast up, and the colour down at the same time. That sort of Jekyll's descent into Hyde at times is one of almost a descent into a living death, because the sort of paleness to the lips and blackness about his eyes is sort of a hallmark of a corpse. So that is that. Okay, chapter 4, the hugely useful personification of London. Nearly a year later, in the month of October, London was startled by a crime of singular ferocity and rendered all the more notable by the high position of the victim. Two huge things going on here. Firstly, London being presented as a person and personified as such. London was startled. Okay, this is, incidentally, for those people counting, either a personification or you can have yourself a transferred epithet. Because it's not London that was startled, it's the people of London. Okay, so it's either a transferred epithet, if you want it to be that, or you can say it's a personification of London, and London acting as one homogeneous organism. but the second part of that statement, which I think we overlook quite a lot, rendered all the more notable by the high position of the victim. It's not just shocking because it's a violent crime. It's shocking because the person is of a high social status. So this is an idea in Victorianism that Stevenson is presenting us the idea, possibly inadvertently actually, that the richer you are, the less likely you are to be a victim of crime. That actually, the richer, the higher up in society you are, the safer you are. That crimes and murders are for poor people. Now, if we think of the incredibly famous set of crimes that come just after this, which is the Jack the Ripper murders, Jack the Ripper almost exclusively killed prostitutes. And that was a sort of, was it a safe thing to do? He never got caught. Was it a safe thing to do? It was a sensationalist set of murders, but people weren't perhaps as bothered about them because it was a woman of ill repute. It was people in the lower classes. If you want to read a really good graphic novel on that, read From Hell. They made it into a really bad film. But Alan Moore wrote the graphic novel, which is... Do I have a copy? Yes, of course I've got a copy. Got a really nice hardback one actually. Yeah, go and read this. It's thick, but it's absolutely beautifully drawn, and it contains all of sort of Alan Moore's research into all the murders at the time and how they actually sort of got away with everything. And the notes in this are actually as interesting as the graphic novel. Absolutely stunning bit of work, well worth a read. No, you cannot borrow my copy because it's really heavy. I don't want to cycle in with it. But the Victorian society was absolutely fascinated with murders. The biggest problem with the Jack the Ripper murders, with solving them, was, as I've said before, too many people confessed. Too many people tried to claim it was them. And this is, if we go right back to about an hour ago when I started talking about this, the fact that Victorians were split between their external public persona and their private persona. And this was a great chance to sort of live vicariously in their private persona, so vicariously through someone else. People became so caught up in these murders. Now, we know that we cannot talk about this as a piece of influencing context because it just happened too late. It happened after the novella was written. But what it was it shows us a bit of framing context. I've got a lot of quotations to get through on Jekyll and Hyde. Christ. Wow, my virtual lesson quotations page has stopped working. Excellent. Oh yeah, I remember. Okay, so sorry, I did something really silly and have possibly crashed my laptop. There we go. So again on the city we have this like consistent use of pathetic fallacy. So although a fog rolled over the city in the small hours, the early part of the night was cloudless, and the lane which the maid's widow overlooked was brilliantly lit by the full moon. This fog keeps appearing and implies that murders are going to take place. We see it trying to the city almost trying to hide elements of itself. It happens all the time through the novella. Now the next bit is our really useful ape-like fury simile, and then our sort of metaphor hailing down a storm of blows. Now there's a really visceral element to this description. So visceral is showing the insides or showing every detail. so the bones were audibly shattered and the body jumped upon the roadway. This is an unusually visceral comment for a Victorian novella. Stevenson is making a point about describing this in a way that is horrifying. And then we have the sort of descent into Soho. So we've talked about east and west. Now these places aren't actually, if you know the sort of geography of London at all, Soho is sort of the east end of the shopping bit of Oxford Street. If you know where Liberties is or anywhere like that, or Carnaby Street, Soho's just past that really. And Cavendish Square, which is where Jekyll lives, is the Hyde Park end of Oxford Street. So these aren't actually separated by that far, but in the Victorian era, it's actually quite a long way in terms of what London is like. Our view of London is this grand, sort of sprawling metropolis that goes out incredibly far now. But places like sort of Hackney or Shoreditch or Spitalfields, all these places would be sort of factories or Dockland or things like this, whereas we now see that to be like quite nicely part of central London. And the square mile as we know it would definitely not be the same as it was then. So Soho really was a sort of den of desperation at this during this era, and it was really a part of London where you didn't go if you were a sort of civilized person. It was by this time about 9 in the morning and the first fog of the season. A great chocolate-covered pall lowered over heaven, but the wind was continually charging and rooting these embattled vapours. Now, that great chocolate-covered pall lowered over heaven, I think we all know that quotation now. In fact, some of you seem to be trying to trot it out in your English language exams for some God knows reason. Now, the first fog of the season implies that there's something bad's going to happen, because we know this pathetic fallacy trope and this motif keeps coming back. But this chocolate-covered pall just lowered over heaven is probably a comment. It's probably a reflection of the amount of pollution over the city of London at this point in time. But it's that lowered over heaven. A pall is a bit of fabric that covers a coffin. But lowered over heaven implies the death of heaven in this point in time, in this era, in this area of London. And then what we get are these vignettes, these bits of London. So a vignette is an image that tells a story. The dismal quarter of Soho, seen under these changing glimpses, with its muddy ways and slatternly passengers, and its lamps, which had never been extinguished or had been kindled afresh to combat this mournful reinvasion of darkness, seemed, in the lawyer's eyes, like a district of some city in a nightmare. This is, again, a bit ham-fisted, a bit too much, but we're shown we're shown through the eyes of Utterson how negative this bit of Soho is, and the simile, like a district of some city in a nightmare, gives us this idea that this is the other side of the dreamscape. On one side we have the road that's called quiet. On this side we have the district of a city in a nightmare. Probably only about 1.5 miles apart. 1.5 miles, maybe a bit further, but not much further than 2 miles. And the lamps that had never been extinguished sort of implies that this is a place where it's always dark, so there's always lamps needed. And then we get our set of vignettes. As the cab drew up before the address indicated, the fog lifted a little and showed him a dingy street, a gin palace, a low French eating house, a shop for the retail of penny numbers and twopenny salads. Many ragged children huddled in the doorways, and many women of many different nationalities passing out, key in hand, to have a morning glass, and the next moment the fog settled down again upon that part, as brown as umber, and cut him off from his blackguardly surroundings. There is a huge number of little vignettes of sort of a pastiche image of the negativity of Soho. All the bits, all the time things, and the ideas of immigration in here, the ideas of alcoholism, of prostitution. That this is a sort of focus, a locus, a point where all of these things sort of come together, and the city is showing Utterson these things. The fog lifted a little and showed him. So the personification of the fog, that the fog almost like lifts itself up to show him. That this is a journey for him. The next bit, this really big chunk, I'm not going to go through, but it shows us the interest in sort of home medicine at this point, home medicine or home science. The important bits being the doctor had bought the house from the heirs of a celebrated surgeon, and his own tastes being rather chemical than anatomical had changed the destination of the block at the bottom of the garden. There is an allusion or reading in that this is actually John Hunter's house, who is the surgeon who started the Hunterian Museum that all of you have been to. So that's quite interesting, a little bit of context there. The next bit I'm just going to pick up on, again, a presentation of the city itself. The fog still slept on the wing above the drowned city, where the lamps glimmered like carbuncles, and through the muffle and smother of these fallen clouds, the procession of the town's life was still rolling in through the great arteries with the sound of a mighty wind. The presentation here is of a living city. The great arteries representing the roads imply the sort of lifeblood of the city ebbing in and out. But also the word carbuncle, that has two meanings to it. One of them is a ruby-like stone, but the other one is a sore or injury. So there's a possible dual presentation here. One of them is this sort of false idea of a glittering peace in the world. The other one is the idea that the city is always in pain and always hurting. And the fog above it, and the sense of a drowned city, that the city is actually sort of drowning in the sense of the fog, that it has no way out of this death. So we're just sort of we've got 7 and 8 left, so 2 chapters left on this now. Now obviously 8 is a hugely long chapter in the oh no, we've got 6 twice. 8 is a hugely long chapter that goes back and retroactively changes the story we've read. So structurally that's quite interesting, because Stevenson leads us through this this novella and then changes everything we've read by giving us the other side of it. And that's quite common to how the sort of detective novel will grow up as a thing. The phrase on this first thing in chapter 6 that I want to pick up on is from the time he had left the house in Soho on the morning of the murder, he was simply blotted out. Okay, and that's the bit I want, is that this idea that people can disappear, can be removed. And if we look back, the hatred that seemed to have surrounded Korea, but his present whereabouts, not a whisper. And this is about Jekyll and Jekyll disappearing. That this city, this drowned city, people can leave or be removed, and Hyde disappears. And that gives us this the mystery that's inherent to the tale, that people are constantly being hunted down but constantly disappearing. But it also and the idea that as a reader we're trying to find people all the time through this. But also it gives us the loneliness of the city that these people exist in, that it just disappears. Again, we have this idea in the next bit of the openness of the face, that it's faces that show the truth of people. He had his death warrant written legibly upon his face. The rosy man had grown pale, his flesh had fallen away, he was visibly balder and older, and yet it was not so much these tokens of a swift physical decay that arrested the lawyer's notice, as a look in the eye and quality of manner that seemed to testify to some deep-seated terror of the mind. And what Stevenson does here is he links the psychological to the physical. That the psychological pain of this man is being is being demonstrated in his physicality. That everything he's thinking about, all these difficulties he's having, is actually being sort of physically manifested in his face and his body. It is one thing to mortify curiosity, another to conquer it, and it may have doubted if, from that day forth, Utterson desired the society of his surviving friend with the same eagerness. It's that phrase, it is one thing to mortify curiosity, another to conquer it. This is one of these times that Robert Louis Stevenson sort of puts in these sort of snappy sound bites of allegorical comments. So these moments that are meant to sort of teach us something as a reader. And I think this is a potentially interpretive comment on addiction. So to mortify curiosity is to sort of kill it. But another to conquer it. So to kill curiosity may well be to kill the self, but to conquer it means to get away from it. And there's this idea that Utterson, who's a very normal, ordinary person, who's incredibly curious about this case of Jekyll and Hyde, his curiosity has been killed off for a while, but it's not been conquered. He hasn't got past it. And so there's an idea. There's a really good novel about opium addiction at this point. It's called Confessions of an English Opium Eater. It's worth a read. And that is about sort of struggling with opium addiction at this point in time. This brown fog that keeps appearing is possibly a connection to opium use. Opium is a brown drug that releases a brown smoke when it's consumed. Just flicking through stuff. And we also see a phrase that keeps being used regularly by other writers after this, is this phrase, the open city. Upon the doorstep and surrounded by the air and sounds of the open city. And this gives us our dichotomy between the outside and the inside, the public and the private. That description of the city as being open implies that in its openness everything is revealed, whereas within its dichotomous opposite, the inside of the house, the private, there is no way of revealing things. So, chapter 8 then. So, chapter 8 is our Chapter 8 is our sort of finale of this, and gives us the... Sorry, I must be missing 9 and 10 for a reason in terms of things. 8 is actually the last night. I don't know why my notes are so bad on this. I apologise. So, chapter 8 is our last night. I want to skip to the second one here. It was a wild, cold, seasonable night of March, with a pale moon lying on her back as though the wind had tilted her, and flying wrack of the most diaphanous and lawny texture. Diaphanous is without substance. The wind made talking difficulty and flecked the blood into the face. It seemed to have swept the streets unusually bare of passengers besides, for Mr. Utterson thought he had never seen that part of London so deserted. This is a really nice bit of pathetic fallacy, and again this idea of the City of London taking control of the actions within it. So the moon lying on its back is turning its face away from the world. But it's the wind that's caused that, and we see the wind as the sort of weapon of London. That it's something that can that it can use to sweep the streets clean. And we see that London is deserted for no reason at all. And it's almost as if the city is trying to protect itself and its inhabitants from the crimes that are being committed. And we get there's a lexical link here at the end of it. His face was white and his voice when he spoke harsh and broken. That's Jekyll being described in exactly the same way as Hyde was earlier in the text. So we're starting to get the sort of denouement of the text at the end of chapter 8. We're starting to get the characters are being drawn together. The next bit, the phial to which I next turned my attention might have been about half full of a blood-red liquor, which was highly pungent to the sense of smell, and seemed to me to contain phosphorus and some volatile ether. At the other ingredients I can make no guess. There's an air of uncertainty. Now we have the blood-red liquor, which is sort of prophetic of the negative nature of this. And we also get the reference to the earlier in this little section to the amateur scientist again. The powders were neatly enough made up, but not with the nicety of the dispensing chemist. So it was plain there of Jekyll's private manufacture. Again, the private intrigue as set against the public persona. So the dispensing chemist does things for the public, and so everything is nicely finished, whereas Jekyll's private investigations into science are unfinished. They're not quite perfect. And we have the sort of redness of blood again, and blood keeps coming up in this sort of section. There's the blood flecked across their face as they turn up at the house. There's the blood red thing. There's the few minims of the red tincture, and then we get in the next chunk the description of how the solution is made up. The mixture, which at first was of a reddish hue, began in proportion as the crystals melted to brighten in colour, to effervesce audibly, and to throw off small fumes of vapour. Suddenly, and at the same moment, the ebullition ceased, and the compound changed to a dark purple, which faded again slowly to a watery green. This transition here from red to purple to green shows the transition that happens within Jekyll and Hyde himself. but also indicates sort of a larger transition of people moving towards science, I think, and moving away from the sort of rich red, which is a sort of traditional symbol of religion as well, of Christianity as well. Now, I think we're now in, so we're now into chapter 10 with I regarded, and and indeed the worst of my faults was a certain impatient gaiety of disposition. So this is Jekyll's full statement of the case. So this is our sort of, we're now on our retroactive narrative. We've gone through Lanyon's embedded narrative. We've had Utterson's third person limited narrative. And so structurally we come to the end and we see that the only person that can truly solve this case for us is the person that was at the centre of it all along. And what's quite interesting is that Utterson doesn't solve the case. He only sort of puts people in the right place. And in the classic trope of Victorian suspense literature, it is the perpetrator of the crime that tells us what happened all along. It is the Agatha Christie style or the Sherlock Holmes style. Everyone in a room, go on then, how did you do it? Okay, so we see this closing structural ending of the text. Now there's a nice little echo here, and the way Jekyll describes himself to the way Utterson is described at the start, and wore more than commonly grave countenance before the public. Utterson is described as having a grave countenance as well. So we see that two characters that are externally very grave, very serious, are actually completely different underneath. Utterson gets involved in trying to solve this case. He becomes a sort of Victorian, he becomes a Sherlock Holmes type character who is also a Victorian character. Whereas Jekyll becomes this sort of prodigal scientific or almost anti-hero. And he concealed his pleasures, he says. And he said, I began to look round me and take stock of my progress and position in the world. I stood already committed to a profound duplicity of me. It's as if society says he has to be duplicitous because that's what is craved of him. That everyone has to be like this. He says, I regarded and hid them with an almost morbid sense of shame. As he becomes more and more sort of successful on the outside, he also becomes more and more corrupt internally. And we see how that happens. Stevenson uses some words which probably would have appeared significantly different to the Victorian public, which led wholly towards the mystic and the transcendental. This isn't science anymore. This is sort of pseudoscience. This is a strange sort of almost religious science. Transcendental is to go beyond the body, and mystic is the non-scientific. He talks about himself in plurals, so members, both sides of my intelligence, and he refers to himself then as that too. I have been doomed to such a dreadful shipwreck that man is not truly one but truly two. I say two because the state of my own knowledge does not pass beyond that point. Now, interestingly, what we get there is a sort of almost Vivet statement. Remember, Louis Vivet is this patient with multiple personality syndrome that was a purported influence on this text. Stevenson gives us this little comment that we can hang on to as a reader. that actually it might not just be two, because Jekyll says all he ever discovered was two. There might be more personalities, more sides of humanity. The dreadful shipwreck as well, that statement that is firstly not an oxymoron. There's, some of you may be noticing that that's actually quite relevant at that point. That he refers to this as an absolute nightmare of a situation. So he describes his sort of looking at himself in the mirror and seeing his hands, and his hands are described in that way, which is of a more of an animal than a human. Lean, coarser, knuckly, of a dusky pallor, and thickly swaddled with a swart growth of hair. So idea of hair being a reference to an animalistic nature. And then when he becomes Hyde, we see the return of the oxymoron. My blood was changed into something exquisitely thin and icy. I don't think thin and icy in reference to blood would ever be seen as a positive, but something exquisitely thin. Like this is absolutely a sense of the difficult positivity of sin. That even though he doesn't want to be this person, he also recognizes that it is an absolute positive at this in how it feels. The last section, and this is the last section of the text itself, is full of our nice little rhetorical questions. Will Hyde die upon the scaffold, or will he find courage to release himself at the last moment? God knows, I am careless. The rhetorical questions show that Jekyll has no concern over his life anymore. That Stevenson presents a character that is tired of being a good person, that is tired of being dichotomous, and wants to just leave it behind and get rid of it. And he's actually quite happy to leave Henry Jekyll, and to fail to be him anymore. Which does beg the question of how, what does Stevenson want us to think at the end of this text? What does he think is the positive side of this? He's heavily criticising a Victorian society that forces people into extremes of duplicity that mean that people end up committing these crimes. But also he presents the character without sin as being unhappy. And so there's also, through the course of it, not really a clear cut of which is the good person. Is it Jekyll or Hyde? Because Hyde is happier, Jekyll is actually quite a sad man through the course of it. And although Hyde commits brutal murders, there's also a sense that he is the more natural, the more accepting of himself. So that's an interesting interpretation for you to sort of muse upon yourself, is that what are we meant to think at the end of this text? How are we meant to feel in terms of, how is the audience meant to feel in terms of which character comes off better, for instance? Okay, that is it for today. I will be back tomorrow with History Boys and then poetry starting at 11 again. Thank you to those guys that have sort of tuned in live, and thank you also to those that are watching it on record as well. Please, if you want any particular focuses for tomorrow, drop me an email and I will endeavour to sort of target those areas as I go through. Some of you did that today. Alright, thank you very much. Have a